Chapter 22. Theosophy of Max Muller. Ancient India. Philosophy of the Vedanta. Tattvam Asi. Knowledge by means of the expansion of consciousness as a reality. Mysticism of different ages and peoples. Unity of experiences. Tertium Organum as a key to mysticism. Signs of the nominal world. Treatise of Plotinus on intelligible beauty as a misunderstood system of higher logic. Illumination in Jacob Boehme. A harp of many strings, of which each string is a separate instrument, while the whole is only one harp. Mysticism of the love of the good. Saint Ava, Dorotheus, and others. Clement of Alexandria. Lao Tzu and Chuang-Tzu. Light on the Path, The Voice of the Silence, Mohammedan Mystics, Poetry of the Sufis, Mystical States under Narcotics, The Antisthetic Revelation, Experiments of Professor James Dostoevsky on Time, the Idiot, Influence of Nature and the Soul of Man. To trace historically the process of the development of those ideas and systems founded upon higher logic or proceeding from it, would indeed be a matter of great interest and importance, but this would be difficult and almost impossible of accomplishment because we lack definite knowledge of the time or origin, the meanings of transmitting, and the sequence of ideas in ancient philosophical systems and religious teachings. There are innumerable guesses and speculations concerning the manner of this succession. Many of these guesses and speculations are accepted as unquestioned until new ones appear which controvert them. The opinions of different investigators in regard to these questions are very divergent, and the truth is often difficult to determine. It would be more accurate to say impossible if conclusions had to be based upon the material accessible to logical investigation. I shall not dwell at all on the question of the succession of ideas, either from the historical or any other point of view. The proposed outline of systems which refer to the world of noumena is not intended to be complete. This is not the history of thought, but merely examples of movements of thought which have led to similar conclusions. In the book Theosophy, or Psychological Religion, the noted scholar Max Muller gives an interesting analysis of mystical religions and mystical philosophical systems. He dwells much on India and her teachings. That which we can study nowhere but in India is the all-absorbing influence which religion and philosophy may exercise on the human mind. So far as we can judge, a large class of people in India, not only the priestly class, but the nobility also, not men only but women, never looked upon their life on earth as something real. What was real to them was the invisible, the life to come. What formed the theme of their conversations, what formed the subject of their meditations, was the real that alone lent some kind of reality to this unreal, phenomenal world. Whoever was supposed to have caught a new ray of truth was visited by young and old, was honored by princes and by kings, was looked upon indeed as holding a position far above that of kings and princes. This is the side of life of ancient India which deserves our study, because there has been nothing like it in the whole world, not even in Greece or Palestine. I know quite well, says Muller, that there never can be a whole nation of philosophers or metaphysical dreamers, and we must never forget that all through history it is the few, not the many, who impress their character on a nation and have a right to represent it as a whole. What do we know of Greece at the time of the Ionian and Eleatic philosophers, except the utterances of 7 sages? What do we know of the Jews at the time of Moses, except the traditions preserved in the laws and the prophets? It is the prophets, the poets, the lawgivers, and teachers, however small their number, who speak in the name of the people, and who alone stand out to represent the nondescript multitude behind them, to speak their thoughts and to express their sentiments. Real Indian philosophy, even in that embryonic form in which we find it in the Upanishads, stands completely by itself. And if we ask what was the highest purpose of the teachings of the Upanishads, we can state it in 3 words, as it has been stated by the great Vedanta teachers themselves, namely Tat Twam Asi. This means thou art that. That stands for that which is known to us under different names in different systems of ancient and modern philosophy. It is Zeus, or the Ies Theos, or Tuon in Greece. It is what Plato meant by the eternal idea, what agnostics call the unknowable, what I call the infinite of nature. This is what in India is called Brahman, the being behind all beings, the power that emits the universe, sustains it, and draws it back again to itself. The thou is what I called the infinite in man, the soul, the self, the being behind every human ego, free from bodily fetters, free from passions, free from all attachment, Atman. The expression, thou art that, means thy soul is the Brahman, or in other words, the subject and the object of all being and all of knowing are one and the same. This is the gist of what I call psychological religion or theosophy, the highest summit of thought which the human mind can have. Let me try it again. This is the gist of what I call psychological religion or theosophy, the highest summit of thought which the human mind has reached, which has found different expressions in different religions and philosophies, but nowhere such a clear and powerful realization as in the ancient Upanishads of India. For as long as the individual soul does not free itself from nescience or a belief in duality, it takes something else for itself. True knowledge of the self, or true self-knowledge, expresses itself in the words, thou art that, or I am Brahman. The nature of Brahman being unchangeable eternal cognition. Until that stage has been reached, the individual soul is fettered by the body, by the organs of sense, nay, even by the mind in its various functions. The soul, the self, says the Vedanta philosopher, cannot be different from the Brahman, because Brahman comprehends all reality, and nothing that reality is can therefore be different from Brahman. Secondly, the individual self cannot be conceived as a modification of Brahman, because Brahman by itself cannot be changed, whether by itself because it is one and perfect in itself, or by anything outside of it, because there exists nothing outside of it. Here we see, says Mueller, the Vedantist moves on exactly the same stratum of thought in the Eleatic philosophers move in Greece. If there is one infinite, they said, there cannot be another, for the other would limit the one and thus render it finite. So, as applied to God, the Eleatics argued, if God is to be the mightiest and the best, he must be one, for if there were two or more, he would not be the mightiest and best. The Eleatics continued their monistic argument by showing that this one infinite being cannot be divided, so that anything could be called a portion of it, because there is no power that could separate anything from it. Nay, it cannot even have parts, for, as it has no beginning and no end, it can have no parts, for a part has a beginning and an end. These Eleatic ideas, namely that there is and there can be only one absolute being, infinite, unchangeable, without a second, without parts and passions, are the same ideas which underlie the Upanishads and have been fully worked out in the Vedanta Sutras. In most of the religions of the ancient world, says Mueller, the relation between the soul and God has been represented as a return of the soul to God. A yearning for God, a kind of divine homesickness, finds expression in most religions, but the road that is to lead us home and the reception which the soul may expect in the Father's house have been represented in very different ways in different religions. According to some religious teachers, a return to the soul to God is possible after death only. According to other religious teachers, the final beatitude of the soul can be achieved in this life. That beatitude requires knowledge only, knowledge of the necessary unity of what is divine in man with what is divine in God. The Brahmins call it self-knowledge. That is to say, the knowledge that our true self, if it is anything, can only be that self which is all in all, and beside which there is nothing else. Sometimes this conception of the intimate relation between the human and the divine natures comes suddenly, as the result of the unexplained intuition of self-recollection. Sometimes, however, it seems as if the force of logic had driven the human mind to the same result. If God had once been recognized as the infinite in nature and the soul as the infinite in man, it seemed to follow that there could not be two infinites. The Eleatics had clearly passed through a similar phase of thought in their own philosophy. If there is an infinite, they said, it is one, for if there were two, they could not be infinite, but would be finite one toward the other. But that which exists is infinite, and there cannot be more such. Therefore, that which exists is one. Nothing can be more definite than this Eleatic monism, and with it the admission of a soul, the infinite in man, as different from God, the infinite in nature, would have been inconceivable. In India, it was so expressed that Brahman and Atman, the spirit, were in their nature one. The early Christians also, at least those who had been brought up in the schools of Neoplatonist philosophy, had a clear perception that if the soul is infinite and immortal in its nature, it cannot be anything besides God, but that it must be of God and in God. St. Paul gave but his own bold expression to the same faith or knowledge when he uttered the words which have startled so many theologians. In him we live and move and have our being. If anyone else had uttered these words, they would at once have been condemned to pantheism. No doubt they are pantheism, and yet they express the very keynote of Christianity. The divine sonship of man is only a metaphorical expression, but it was meant originally to embody the same idea. And when the question was asked how the consciousness of this divine sonship could ever have been lost, the answer given by Christianity was by sin. The answer given by Upanishads was by avidya, nescience. This marks the similarity and the same time the characteristic difference between these two religions. The question how nescience laid hold on the human soul and made it imagine that it could live or move or have its true being anywhere but in Brahman remains as unanswerable in Hindu philosophy as in Christianity. The question how sin first came into the world. Both philosophies, that of the East and that of the West, says Mueller, start from a common point, namely from the conviction that our ordinary knowledge is uncertain, if not altogether wrong. This revolt of the human mind against itself is the first step in all philosophy. In our own philosophical language, we may put the question thus: how did the real become phenomenal, and how can the phenomenal become real again? Or, in other words, how was the infinite changed into the finite? How was the eternal changed into the temporal? And how can the temporal regain its eternal nature? Or, to put it into more familiar language, how was this world created, and how can it be untreated again? Nescience or Avdya is regarded as the cause of the phenomenal semblance. In the Upanishads, the meaning of Brahman changes. Sometimes it is almost an objective God, existing separately from the world. But then we see Brahman as the essence of all things, and the soul, knowing that it is no longer separated from that essence, learns the highest lesson of the whole Vedanta doctrine. Tat Twam Asi, thou art that. That is to say, thou who for a time didst seem to be something by thyself, art really nothing apart from the divine essence. To know Brahman is to be Brahman. Almost in the same words as the Eleatic philosophers and the German mystics of the 14th century, the Vedantists argued that it would be self-contradictory to admit that there could be anything besides the infinite of Brahman, which is all in all, and that therefore the soul also cannot be anything different from it, can never claim a separate and independent existence. Brahman has to be conceived as perfect and therefore unchangeable. The soul cannot be conceived as a real modification or deterioration of Brahman. That is deterioration. Yes. And as Brahman has neither beginning nor end, neither can it have any parts. Therefore, the soul cannot be a part of Brahman, but the whole of Brahman must be present in every individual soul. This is the same as the teaching of Plotinus, who held with equal consistency that the true being is totally present in every part of the universe. The Vedanta philosophy rests on the foundation thesis that the soul or the absolute being or Brahman are one in their essence. The fundamental principle of the Vedanta philosophy is that in reality there exists and there can exist nothing but Brahman. That Brahman is everything. Idealistic philosophy has swept away this world-old prejudice more thoroughly in India than anywhere else. The nescience which creates the separation between the individual soul and Brahman can be removed by science or knowledge only, and this knowledge or Vidya is imparted by the Vedanta, which shows that all our ordinary knowledge is simply the result of ignorance or nescience, is uncertain, deceitful, and perishable, or as we should say, is phenomenal, relative, and conditioned. The true knowledge or complete insight cannot be gained by sensuous perception nor by inference. According to the orthodox Vedantist, Shruti alone, or what is called revelation, can impart that knowledge and remove that nescience which is innate in human nature, or the higher Brahman. Nothing. Sorry, I'm messing up today. Trying. It's just tongue gets tied. Of the higher Brahman, nothing can be predicated. Predicated, but that it is, and that through the nescience it appears to be this or that. When an Indian sage was asked to describe Brahman, he was simply silent. That was his answer. When it is said that Brahman is, that means at the same time the Brahman is not. That is to say, that Brahman is nothing of what is supposed to exist in our sensuous perceptions. Whatever we may think of this philosophy, we cannot deny its metaphysical boldness and its logical consistency. If Brahman is all in all, the one without a second, nothing can be said to exist that is not Brahman. There is no room for anything outside the infinite and the universal. Nor is there room for two infinities, for the infinite in nature and the infinite in man. There is and there can be one infinite and one Brahman only. This is the beginning and the end of the Vedanta. As the shortest summary of the ideas of the Vedanta, two verses of Sankara, the commentator and interpreter of Vedanta, are often quoted. Brahma is true, the world is false. The soul is Brahma and is nothing else. This is really a perfect summary. What truly and really exists is Brahman, the one absolute being. The world is false, or rather, is not what it seems to be. That is, everything which is present to us by means of sense is phenomenal and relative and can be nothing else. The soul again, or rather every man's soul, though it may seem to be this or that, is in reality nothing but Brahma. In relation to the question of the origin of the world, two famous commentators of the Vedanta, Sankara and Ramanuja, differ. Ramanuja holds to the theory of evolution, Sankara to the theory of illusion. It is very important to observe that the Vedantist does not go so far as certain Buddhist philosophers who look upon the phenomenal world as simply nothing. No, their world is real, only it is not what it seems to be. Sankara claims for the phenomenal world a reality sufficient for all practical purposes, sufficient to determine our practical life, our moral obligations. There is a veil, but the Vedanta philosophy teaches us that the eternal light behind it can always be perceived more or less clearly through philosophical knowledge. It can be perceived because in reality it is always there. It may seem strange to find the results of the philosophy of Kant and his followers thus anticipated under varying expressions in the Upanishads and in the Vedanta philosophy of ancient India. In the chapters about the Logos and about Christian theosophy, Max Muller says that religion is the bridge between the visible and the invisible, between finite and infinite. It may be truly said that the founders of the religions of the world have all been bridge builders. As soon as the existence of beyond, of a heaven above the earth, of powers above us and beneath us has been recognized, a great gulf seemed to be fixed. Among contemporary thinkers, the noted psychologist Professor William James approached nearer than all others to the ideas of Max Muller's theosophy. In the last chapter of his book, The Varieties of a Religious Experience, Professor James says, "The warring gods and formulas of the various religions do indeed cancel each other, but there is a certain uniform deliverance in which religions all appear to meet. This is the liberation of the soul. Man becomes conscious that if his higher part is conterminous and continuous with a more of the same quality, which is operative in the universe outside of him, and which he can keep in working touch with, and in a fashion get on board of, he can save himself when all his lower being has gone to pieces in the wreck." What is the objective truth of content of religious experiences? Is such a more merely our own notion, or does it really exist? If so, in what shape does it exist? And in what form should we conceive of that union with it of which religious geniuses are so convinced? It is in answering these questions that the various theologies perform their theoretic work, and that their divergencies most come to light. They all agree that the more really exists, though some of them hold it to exist in the shape of a personal god or gods, while others are satisfied to conceive it as a stream of ideal tendency. It is when they treat of the experience of union with it that their speculative differences appear most clearly. Over this point, pantheism and theism, nature and second birth, works and grace and karma, immortality and reincarnation, rationalism and mysticism carry on invertebrate disputes. At the end of my lecture on philosophy, I held out the notion that an impartial science of religions might sift out from the midst of their discrepancies a common body of doctrine which she might also formulate on terms to which physical science need not object. This, I said, she might adopt as her own reconciling hypothesis and recommend it for general belief. Let me then propose as the hypothesis to whatever it may be on its farther side, the more with which in religious experience we feel ourselves connected is on its hither side the subconscious continuation of our conscious life. The conscious person is continuous with a wider self. The further limits of our being plunge, it seems to me, into an altogether other dimension of existence from the sensible and merely understandable world. Name it the mystical region or the supernatural region, we belong to it in a more intimate sense than that in which we belong to thy visible world, for we belong in the most intimate sense wherever our ideals belong. The communion with this visible world is a real process with real results. Personal religious experience has its roots and center in mystical states of consciousness. But what, after all, is mysticism? Returning to the terminology established in the foregoing chapters, we may say that mystical states of consciousness are closely bound up with knowledge received under conditions of expanded receptivity. Until quite recently, philosophy did not recognize the reality of the mystical experience and regarded all mystical states as pathological ones, unhealthy conditions of the normal consciousness. Even now, many positive psychologists hold on this opinion, embracing in one common classification real mystical states, pseudo-mystical perversions of the usual state, purely psychopathic states, and more or less conscious deceit. This, of course, can be of no assistance to a correct understanding of the question. Before going further, let us therefore establish certain criteria for the identification of real mystical states. Professor James enumerates the following: infallibility, noetic quality, transiency, passivity. But some of these characteristics belong to simple emotional states, and he fails to define exactly how mystical states can be distinguished from emotional ones of analogous character. Considering mystical states as knowledge by expanded consciousness, it is possible to give quite definite criteria for their discernment and their differentiation from the generality of psychic experiences. 1. Mystical states give knowledge which nothing else can give. 2. Mystical states give knowledge of the real world with all its signs and characteristics. 3. The mystical states of men of different ages and different peoples exhibit an astonishing similarity, sometimes amounting to complete identity. 4. The results of the mystical experience are entirely illogical from our ordinary point of view. They are superlogical, i.e., tertium organum, which is the key to mystical experience, is applicable to them in all its entirety. The last named criterion is especially important. The illogicality of the data of mystical experience forced science to repudiate them. Now we have established that illogicality, from our standpoint, is the necessary condition of the knowledge of truth or of the real world. This does not mean that everything that is illogical is true and real, but it means absolutely that everything true and real is illogical from our standpoint. We have established the fact that it is impossible to approach the truth with our logic, and we have also established the possibility of penetrating into these heretofore inaccessible regions by means of the new canon of thought. The consciousness of the necessity for such an instrument of thought undoubtedly existed from far back, For what, in substance, does the formula tot twam asi represent, if not the fundamental axiom of higher logic? Thou art that means thou art both thou and not thou, and corresponds to the superlogical formula A is both A and not A. If we examine ancient writings from this standpoint, then we shall understand that their authors were searching for a new logic and were not satisfied with the logic of the things of the phenomenal world. The seeming illogicality of ancient philosophical systems, which portrayed an ideal world, as it were, instead of an existing one, will then become comprehensible. For in these portrayals of an ideal world, systems of higher logic often lie concealed. One such misunderstood attempts to construe a system of higher logic to give a precise instrument of thought penetrating beyond the limits of the visible world in the treatise by Plotinus on intelligible beauty. Describing heaven and the gods, Plotinus says, all the gods are venerable and beautiful, and their beauty is immense. What else, however, is it but intellect through which they are such? And because intellect energizes in them in so great a degree as to render them visible by its light. For it is not because their bodies are beautiful, for these gods that have bodies do not through this derive their substance as gods, but these also are gods through intellect. For they are not at one time wise, and at another destitute of wisdom, but they are always wise in an impassive, stable, and pure intellect. They likewise know all things, not human concerns, precandenously, but their own, which are divine, and such as intellect sees. For all things there are heaven, and there the earth is heaven, as also are the sea, animals, plants, and men. The gods likewise that it contains do think men undeserving of their regard, nor anything else that is there, because everything there is divine, and they occupy and pervade without ceasing the whole of that blissful region. For the life which is there is unattended with labor and truth, as Plato says in Phaedrus, is the generator, the nutriment, their essence and nurse. They likewise see all things, not those with which generation, but those with which essence is present. And they perceive themselves in others. For all things there are diaphanous, and nothing is dark and resisting. But everything is apparent to every one internally and throughout. For light everywhere meets with light, since everything contains all things in itself and again sees all things in another. So that all things are everywhere, and all is all. Each thing likewise is everything, and the splendor there is infinite. For everything there is great, since even that which is small is great. The sun too, which is there, is all the stars, and again each star is the sun, and all the stars. In each, however, a different property predominates, but at the same time all things are visible in each. Motion likewise there is pure, for the motion is not confounded by a mover different from it. Permanency also suffers no change of its nature, because it is not mingled with the unstable. And the beautiful there is beautiful, because it does not subsist in beauty as in a subject. Each thing too is there established, not as in a foreign land, but the seed of each thing is that which each thing is. Nor is the thing itself different from the place in which it subsists, for the subject of the intellect, and it is itself intellect. Each part always proceeds from the whole, and is at the same time each part of the whole. For it appears indeed as a part, but by him whose sight is acute, it will be seen as a whole. There is likewise no weariness of the vision which is there, nor any plenitude of perception which can bring intuition to an end. For neither was there any vacuity which, when filled, might cause the visive energy to cease, nor is there one thing, but that another, so as to occasion a part of one thing, is not to be amicable with that of another. And the knowledge which is possible there is insatiable, for by seeing itself more abundantly it perceives both itself and the objects of its perception to be infinite. It follows its own nature, unceasing contemplation. The life there is wisdom, a wisdom not obtained by reasoning process, because the whole of it always was, and is not in any respect deficient, so as to be in want of investigation. But it is the first wisdom, and is not derived from another. Closely akin to Plotinus is Jacob Boheme, who was a common shoemaker in the German town of Gorlitz, end of the, 16th and the beginning of the 17th century, and has left a whole series of remarkable writings in which he describes revelations vouchsafed him in moments of illumination. His first illumination occurred in 1600 AD when he was 25 years old. Sitting one day in his room, let me make sure that's recording. Okay. Sitting one day in his room, his eyes fell upon a burnished pewter dish, which reflected the sunshine with such marvelous splendor that he fell into an inward ecstasy, and it seemed to him as if he could now look into the principles and deepest foundations of things. He believed that it was only a fancy, and in order to banish it from his mind, he went out upon the green. But here he remarked that he gazed into the very heart of things, the very herbs and grass, and that actual nature harmonized with what he had inwardly seen. He said nothing of this to anyone, but praised and thanked God in silence. Of the first illumination, Boheme's biographer says, he learned to know the innermost foundation of nature and acquire the capacity to see henceforth with the eyes of the soul into the heart of all things, a faculty which remained with him even in his normal condition. About the year 1600, in the 25th year of his age, he was again surrounded by the divine light and replenished with the heavenly knowledge, insomuch as going abroad in the fields to a green before Ney's gate at Gorlitz, he there sat down, and, viewing the herbs and grass of the field in his inward light, he saw in their essences, use, and properties, which were discovered to him by their lineaments, figures, and signatures. In like manner he beheld the whole creation, and from that foundation he afterwards wrote his book De Signature Rerum. It's murder. De Signature Rerum, in the unfolding of those mysteries before his understanding, he had a great measure of joy, yet returned home and took care of his family, and lived in great peace and silence, scarce intimating to any these wonderful things that had befallen him. And in the year 1610, being again taken into this light, lest the mysteries revealed to him should pass through him as the stream, and rather for a memorable than intending any publication, he wrote his first book called Aurora, or The Morning Redness. The first illumination, in 1600, was not complete. 10 years later, 1610, he had another remarkable inward experience. What he had previously seen only chaotically, fragmentarily, and in isolated glimpses, he now beheld as coherent whole and in more definite outlines. When his third illumination took place, that which in former visions had appeared to him chaotic and multifarious was now recognized by him as a unity, like a sharp of many strings, of which each string is a separate instrument, while the whole is only one harp. He now recognized the divine order of nature and how from the trunk of the tree of life sprung different branches, bearing manifold leaves and flowers and fruits, and he became impressed with the necessity of writing down what he saw and preserved the record. He himself speaks of this final and complete illumination as follows. The gate was opened to me that in 1/4 of an hour I saw and knew more than I had been many years at a university, at which I exceedingly admired and thereupon turned my praise to God for it. For I saw and knew the being of all beings, the bis and abyss and the eternal generation of the Holy Trinity, the descent and original of the world and all creatures through divine wisdom. I knew and saw in myself all the three worlds, namely, 1, the divine, angelical, and paradisical, 2, and the dark, the original of the nature to the fire, and 3, the external, invisible world, being a procreation of external birth from both the internal and spiritual worlds. And I saw and I knew the whole working essence in the evil and the good and the original of the existence of each of them, and likewise how the fruitful bearing womb of eternity brought forth, so that I did not only greatly wonder at it, but did also exceedingly rejoice. Describing illuminations, Boehme writes in one of his books, "Suddenly my spirit did break through, even in the innermost birth of genitor of the deity, and there I was embraced with love, as a bridegroom embraces his dearly beloved bride. But the greatness of the triumphing that was in the spirit I cannot express either in speaking or writing, neither can it be compared to anything, but that wherein the life is generated in the midst of death, and it is like the resurrection from the dead. In this light my spirit suddenly saw through all, and in and by all creatures, even in herbs and grass, it knew God, who he is, and how he is, and what his work is. And suddenly in that light my will was set on by a mighty impulse to describe the being of God. But because I could not presently apprehend the deepest births of God in their being, and comprehend them in my reason, there passed almost 12 years before the exact understanding thereof was given me. And it was with me as with a young tree which is planted on the ground, and at first is young and tender and flourishing to the eye, especially if it comes on lustily in its growing, but it does not bear fruit presently, and though it blossoms, they fall off. Also many a cold wind, frost, and snow puff upon it, before it comes to any growth and bearing fruit." Boehme's books are full of wonderment before these mysteries with which he was confronted. I was as simple concerning the hidden mysteries as the meanest of all, but my vision of the wonders of God taught me, so that I must write of his wonders, though indeed my purpose is to write this for the memorandum for myself. Not I, the I that I am, know these things, but God knows them in me. If you will behold your own self and the outer world, and what is taking place thereon, you will find that you, with regard to your external being, are that external world. The dialogues between disciple and master are remarkable. Disciple and master should be understood to refer to the lower and the higher consciousness of man. The disciple said to his master, "How may I come to the supersensual life, that I may see God and hear him speak?" His master said, "When thou canst grow thyself but for a moment into that where no creature dwelleth, then thou hearest what God speaketh." Disciple, is that near at hand or far off? Master, it is in thee, and if thou canst for a while but cease from all thy thinking and willing, then thou shalt hear the unspeakable words of God. Disciple, how can I hear him speak when I stand from thinking and willing? Master, When thou standest still from the thinking of self and the willing of self, when both thy intellect and will are quiet and passive to the impressions of the eternal world and spirit, and when thy soul is winged up and above that which is temporal, the outward senses and imagination being locked up by holy abstraction, then the eternal hearing, seeing, and speaking will be revealed in thee, and so God heareth and seeth through thee, being now the origin of his spirit, and so God speaketh in thee, and whispereth to thy spirit, and thy spirit heareth his voice. Blessed art thou therefore, if thou canst stand still from self-thinking and self-willing, and canst stop the wheel of imagination and senses, for as much as hereby thou mayest arrive at length to see thy great salvation of God, being capable of all manner of divine sensations and heavenly communications, since it is not indeed but thine own hearing and willing that do wonder thee, so that thou dost not see and hear God. Disciple, loving master, I can no more endure anything should divert me. How shall I find the nearest way to him? Master, where the way is hardest, there walk thou, and take up what thou world rejecteth, and what the world doth, and do not thou. Walk contrary to the world in all things, and thou comest the nearest way to him. Disciple, on how may I arrive at the unity of will, and how come into the unity of vision? Master, mark now what I say. The right eye looketh in thee into eternity, the left eye looketh backward into thee into time. If now thou sufferest thyself to be always looking into nature and the things of time, it will be impossible for thee ever to arrive at the unity which thou wishes for. Remember this, and be upon thy watch. Give not thy mind leave to enter in, nor to fill itself with that which is without thee. Neither look thou backward upon thyself. Let not thy left eye deceive thee by making continually one representation after another, and stirring up thereby an earnest longing in the propriety. But let thy right eye command back this left, and only bringing the eye of time into the eye of eternity, and descending through the light of God into the light of nature, thou shalt arrive at the unity of vision or uniformity of will. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop right there. Boy, I butchered that, but I try, probably about another 6 or 8 pages to go. And thanks.